The wind in the Montana Territory of 1887 was a sculptor of land and souls. It peeled paint from the false-fronted buildings of Redemption Gulch, carried the grit that settled in the lines around a man's eyes, and whispered truths no one dared speak aloud. Law was a suggestion, often overruled by the sharp report of a six-gun or the heavier weight of public opinion. Today, in the makeshift courthouse that smelled of stale tobacco and anxious sweat, public opinion was a hammer poised to fall. Abigail May Harlow felt its shadow. At 23, she was a widow, though not in the way the town respected. Her husband had been the promise of a future, a sweet boy with kind hands who had coughed his life away into a blood-stained handkerchief before he could give her his name in front of a preacher. He had, however, given her a son, Samuel, and in the eyes of Redemption Gulch, that was her unforgivable sin. She knelt on the rough-hewn floorboards, not in prayer, but because her legs had given out. The baby, swaddled in a worn but clean blanket, slept in the crook of her arm, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythm of perfect innocence. He was 6 months old, a lifetime in this hard country, and the sum of all her worth. A shaft of sunlight cut through the grimy window pane, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, each one a silent witness to her humiliation. On the raised platform, Judge Amos Trigg sat like a bloated vulture surveying a feast. His face was a roadmap of self-satisfaction, his belly straining the buttons of his waistcoat. He was not a man of law so much as a man of judgment, and he wielded it with the precision of a butcher's cleaver. He represented the town's virtue, its unyielding, unforgiving piety. "The facts are plain," the judge boomed, his voice filling the crowded room. "The woman, Abigail May Harlow, is without husband, without property, and without means. She lives in a single room at the boarding house, dependent on the charity of others." He gestured a dismissive hand toward her. "She has brought into this world a child with no name to carry, no father to provide for him, a child born of indiscretion." A murmur rippled through the spectators, the women in their bonnets and calico dresses, the men in their dusty hats. All eyes were on her. Some held pity. She thought a thin, useless kind of pity. Most held scorn. They saw her as a stain, a warning to their own daughters. They saw her poverty as a moral failing and her son as the proof. Abigail looked for a friendly face and found only one. Mrs. Ruth, the owner of the boarding house, stood near the back wall, a woman whose kindness was as quiet and steady as the rising of the sun. Mrs. Ruth had taken her in, had asked for no more rent than Abigail could provide from mending and washing, had never once looked at Samuel with anything but love. Her face now was a mask of helpless anger. Sheriff Dugan stood beside the judge's bench, his arms crossed over his chest. He was a hard man, his jaw perpetually tight, but his eyes betrayed a deep discomfort. He had carried out the judge's summons, had ensured Abigail appeared, because that was his duty. But he had not looked her in the eye all morning. He was a man of statutes and warrants, and this felt too much like a sermon, too much like a public shaming dressed up as civic duty. He kept his gaze fixed on a crack in the far wall, as if he could find the letter of the law written there. "This is not a question of punishment," Judge Trigg continued, leaning forward with a conspiratorial air, as if he were sharing a great and sorrowful wisdom. "It is a question of welfare, the welfare of the child. What future can he have with a mother who cannot feed herself? Let alone him, what moral guidance can she provide? We have a responsibility, a sacred duty, to see that this boy is given a chance at a decent, God-fearing life, a chance he will not have in these circumstances." Abigail's knuckles were white where she clutched the blanket. This was a lie wrapped in the language of concern. They did not care for Samuel's welfare. They cared for their own comfort. Her presence, her beautiful, blameless boy, was a burr under the saddle of their tidy lives. They wanted her gone. They wanted the evidence of a love that existed outside their rules to be erased. The orphanage in Bozeman was a place children were sent not to be saved, but to be forgotten. "I can work," Abigail said, her voice a raw whisper that barely carried past the first row. She forced herself to speak louder, to find a strength she did not feel. "I am strong. I can provide for my son. Just give me a chance." Judge Trigg scoffed. "A wet, unpleasant sound. A chance, you have had your chance. Madam, every day you remain in this condition is a day you fail him. This town cannot and will not abide it." He looked to Sheriff Dugan. "Sheriff, you will take the child. Arrangements will be made for his transport." The word struck Abigail with a physical force. A cold dread washed over her, so profound it stole the air from her lungs. Samuel, sensing his mother's terror, began to stir. His little face puckered, and a small whimper escaped his lips. "No," Abigail breathed. "Please, no, you cannot. He is all I have." Sheriff Dugan did not move. His face was granite. He looked at the judge, then at Abigail, then back at the crack in the wall. A deputy, a young man with nervous eyes, shifted his weight, his hand hovering near his pistol, as if a grieving mother were a threat he might need to subdue. "Sheriff," the judge commanded, his voice sharp with impatience. Slowly, Sheriff Dugan took a step forward. He stopped in front of her. He was a tall man, and from her position on the floor, he seemed a mountain. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "give me the boy." "Please, Sheriff," she begged, tears now streaming down her face, tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. "Do not do this. I am his mother." "The court has decided," he said, though there was no conviction in his tone. He reached down, his large, calloused hands surprisingly hesitant. Samuel began to cry in earnest now, a full-throated wail of infant distress that filled the suffocating silence of the room. It was a sound that should have shattered every heart, but it only seemed to harden the resolve on the faces of the townsfolk. Abigail hugged her son to her chest, turning away from the sheriff's hands, a desperate, futile gesture of protection. "You will not take him from me," she sobbed. "You will not." The deputy stepped forward, more determined than the sheriff. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "Ma'am, you are making this harder than it needs to be." The gavel slammed down on the judge's bench. The sound was like a gunshot, final and absolute. "The decision is made. Take the child." The room held its breath. The deputy's hands closed around the precious bundle in her arms. Abigail's world narrowed to that single, violating touch, the rough feel of his fingers on the blanket that held her son. It was over. The wind, the grit, the judgment. They had won. Despair, bleak and total, washed through her. Then a voice cut through the stillness. "Unfit to be a mother, you say." It was not loud, but it had the deep, resonant timbre of aged wood and solid rock. It was a voice that knew long silences and open spaces, a voice that did not waste words. It came from the back of the courtroom, from the shadows by the door. Every head turned. The deputy froze, his hands still on the baby. Judge Trigg squinted, his authority momentarily forgotten in his surprise. A man stepped out of the shadows and into the shaft of dusty light. He was not tall, but broad, with shoulders that spoke of a life of hard labor. His clothes were plain, durable denim and worn leather, coated in the dust of the trail. His face was weathered, his eyes the color of a stormy sky, and in their depths was a profound and settled sorrow. He was Luke Brennan. The town knew him, but only as a silhouette. The solitary rancher from the broken hills spread north of town. A man who kept to himself, who bought his supplies and spoke to no one, who had disappeared into his own grief years ago after a fire had claimed his wife and child. He was a ghost at the edge of their community, and his sudden presence in the heart of it was a shock that silenced every tongue. He walked down the central aisle, his boots making a slow, deliberate sound on the floorboards. He did not look at the judge. He did not look at the gawking faces of the townspeople. His gaze was fixed on Abigail and the crying child. He stopped before the little group, the cowering mother, the wailing infant, the conflicted sheriff, the uncertain deputy. The air crackled with unspoken questions. What was the grieving recluse doing here? Luke Brennan reached out. His movements were unhurried, yet filled with an undeniable purpose. He did not reach for Abigail. He reached for her son. He gently, but with an unbreakable firmness, took Samuel from the deputy's grasp. The young officer offered no resistance, stepping back as if pushed by an invisible force. The baby, who had been screaming, suddenly quieted. He looked up at the strange, weathered face above him, his blue eyes wide with curiosity. Luke held him not with the awkwardness of an unfamiliar man, but with a tenderness that was both heartbreaking and profound. He adjusted the blanket, his large, rough hands moving with an instinct he must have thought was long buried. He held the child against his chest, shielding him from the eyes of the room. He looked down at Abigail, still kneeling on the floor, her face a mess of tears and disbelief. Then he raised his head, his stormy eyes finally meeting the judge's, and in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, yet one that every soul in that room heard as clearly as a thunderclap on a dry plain. He spoke the words that changed everything. "He is ours now." The silence that followed Luke Brennan's words was more profound than the noise that had preceded them. It was a thick, heavy silence, broken only by the soft gurgle Samuel made against the rancher's shoulder. Abigail stared, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. She did not know this man. She had seen him in town, perhaps a handful of times over the years, a distant figure loading supplies onto a wagon, his face always shadowed by the brim of his hat, his presence as unremarkable as a fence post on the prairie. Yet here he was, holding her son as if he had every right in the world, defying the entire town with 2 quiet words. Judge Amos Trigg was the first to recover, his face, which had been pale with shock, flooded with a mottled, apoplectic red. "What is the meaning of this intrusion? This is a court of law. Brennan, you have no standing here." Luke did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His calm was more powerful than the judge's blustering. He shifted Samuel slightly in his arms, settling the baby's weight more comfortably. "The boy needs a father, a name, a home. I am giving him all 3. He looked directly at the judge, his stormy eyes unwavering. "I am claiming him. I will sign whatever papers are required to make me his legal father." A collective gasp swept the room. It was one thing to interrupt a proceeding. It was another thing entirely to propose such a radical, unheard-of solution. The whispers started then, a low hiss of speculation that spread like wildfire through dry grass. Luke Brennan, the man who had walled himself off from the world, was taking in another man's child, and the mother along with him. The scandal was so immense, so delicious, that it momentarily eclipsed their righteous condemnation of Abigail. Sheriff Dugan, who had been frozen in place, finally seemed to find his footing. He looked from Luke to the judge, his expression unreadable. "Judge, this is irregular. Irregular. It is an outrage, an affront to decency." Trigg sputtered, slamming his hand on the bench, though it lacked the definitive crack of his gavel. He pointed a trembling finger at Luke. "You cannot simply walk in here and lay claim to a child as if he were a stray calf. There are procedures, laws." "Then follow them," Luke said, his tone even. "Drop the documents. I will sign them. My ranch, Broken Hill, is solvent. The boy will want for nothing. He will have a roof over his head and food in his belly. That is more than your orphanage can promise, and you know it." The judge opened his mouth, then closed it again. Luke's statement had cut to the heart of the matter, stripping away the veneer of moral concern to expose the practical reality beneath. The town did not want the burden of another orphan. Luke Brennan was offering to take that burden, and his finances were beyond question. To deny his offer would be to admit that this hearing was never about the child's welfare, but about punishing the mother. Judge Trigg, for all his pomposity, was trapped. Abigail slowly, shakily, pushed herself to her feet. Her legs felt like water. Her gaze was locked on Luke. Gratitude warred with a terrifying bewilderment. Why was he doing this? He was a stranger. They had no connection, no history. This act of salvation was so absolute, so unexpected. It felt like a dream. She half expected to wake up on the floor of her small room at the boarding house. The whole humiliating morning a nightmare. Luke turned his head, and his eyes met hers for the first time. There was no warmth in them, no hint of compassion. There was only a kind of grim resolve, a deep, unyielding seriousness that frightened her as much as it reassured her. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the door. It was not an invitation. It was a command. Without a word, she moved. She walked past the stunned face of the deputy, past the rigid form of the sheriff. She could feel the stares of the townspeople on her back, burning with a new kind of fire. It was no longer just scorn. Now it was mixed with a feverish curiosity. She did not look at any of them. She did not look at Mrs. Ruth, though she felt a pang of guilt for leaving without a word of thanks. Her entire world had been upended in a matter of minutes, and the only solid thing in it was the broad back of the man walking in front of her, carrying her son out of that suffocating room and into the harsh, cleansing light of the Montana sun. The journey to Broken Hill Ranch was made in near total silence. Luke untied a sturdy buckboard wagon, its wood weathered to a silver gray. He placed Samuel, who had fallen back asleep, into a crate lined with a horse blanket, securing it in the wagon bed. Abigail climbed onto the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Luke took the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, set the two stout horses into motion. They left Redemption Gulch behind, its petty judgments and stifling piety shrinking in a cloud of dust. The landscape opened up, vast and unforgiving. The sun beat down on fields of grass burned to the color of old gold. The wind, which had been a tormentor in town, was a constant, indifferent companion out here, whipping loose strands of her hair across her face. They passed no other travelers. The world felt empty, populated only by the three of them, the rhythmic plodding of the horses and the creak of the wagon wheels. Abigail stole glances at the man beside her. His profile was stark, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He seemed a part of the landscape itself, carved from the same stubborn, unyielding material as the distant mountains. What was she to make of him? Was this an act of charity, an impulse, or something else? Something she could not begin to comprehend. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing mile, filled with all the things she was too afraid to ask. Late in the afternoon, he turned the horses off the main track and onto a smaller, less traveled path that wound its way into a series of low, rolling hills. The grass here was a little greener, and she could see a line of cottonwood trees in the distance, a sure sign of water. Presently, the ranch came into view. Broken Hill was not a place of beauty, but of stark function. A long, low barn, built of thick, dark timber, stood as the main structure. Beside it were a series of corrals and a blacksmith's shed. The house itself was a simple log cabin, larger than most, but with no frills, no porch, no paint. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, the only sign of welcome in the entire valley. It was a place built for solitude, a fortress against the world. It was the home of a man who did not expect company. Luke pulled the wagon to a halt in the dusty yard and set the brake. He said nothing, simply climbing down and walking to the back of the wagon to retrieve Samuel. The baby was awake now, but calm, his eyes blinking in the strange new light. Luke held him with that same surprising ease as before. "The house is there," he said, gesturing with his chin. "There is a room at the back. It will be yours." Abigail slid down from the wagon seat. her whole body aching from the tension of the day. She followed him toward the cabin, her steps uncertain on the hard-packed earth. The inside of the house was as plain as the outside. The main room consisted of a large stone fireplace, a long table with 2 benches, and a few rough shelves holding tins and sacks of flour. It was clean, but starkly masculine, the air smelling of wood smoke, leather, and coffee. There was no softness here, no woman's touch. The absence of it was a palpable presence, a ghost that haunted the corners of the room. He led her through to a small room at the back. It contained a simple rope bed with a straw mattress, a small washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a single window that looked out onto the endless expanse of the prairie. It was more than she had, but it felt as lonely as the moon. Luke placed Samuel gently on the bed. The baby kicked his feet and made a happy sound. For a moment, a flicker of something unreadable passed through Luke's eyes as he looked at the child. It was there and gone in an instant, replaced by the same closed expression as before. He turned to face her. The space between them felt charged, a current of unspoken emotion running through the still air. He was a stranger, and she was in his house, under his protection. A situation more bewildering than the poverty she had left behind. "You can stay," he said, his voice low and flat, devoid of any warmth. He held her gaze, and she felt pinned by the intensity in his eyes. "You and the boy. You will have a roof and you will have food, but do not think I am doing this out of pity." The words were like a slap. Pity was something she had endured for months. The condescending glances, the charitable donations of old clothes. She had thought for a fleeting moment that this man's actions had lifted her beyond that, but his declaration made her feel her position more keenly than ever. She was not a guest. She was a burden he had chosen, for his own reasons, to accept. A fresh wave of shame washed over her, hot and bitter. She was still an object of charity. Only the benefactor had changed. "Then why?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. "Why did you do it?" He looked away from her then, his gaze going to the window, to the vast, empty land that was his kingdom. The silence stretched, and she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, as if the words were being pulled from a great and painful depth. "I made a promise once," he said, more to the window than to her, "to protect the innocent." He said nothing more. He did not explain the promise, or to whom it was made. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with her sleeping son and 1,000 unanswered questions. That night, Abigail lay awake on the straw mattress, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house, the sigh of the wind around the logs, the distant lowing of a cow, the soft pop and crackle of the dying embers in the main room's fireplace. Luke had not returned. She assumed he had a room of his own, somewhere else in the silent, lonely house. A deep and profound sense of dislocation settled over her. She was safe from the town, but she had traded one kind of prison for another. Here, the bars were made of a stranger's motives and the weight of an unspoken debt. Luke, for his part, was not in another room. He was in the barn, his back against a rough wooden stall, a bottle of whiskey untouched beside him. He could still feel the phantom weight of the baby in his arms, could still see the trusting blue eyes looking up at him. The feeling had cracked open a door inside him that he had nailed shut and barricaded years ago. Behind that door was the memory of another small child, a daughter with her mother's smile, and the suffocating smell of smoke. His coldness toward Abigail was not for her. It was for him. It was a wall he was desperately trying to rebuild, brick by painful brick. He had saved her son from the town, but he did not know if he could save himself from the memories the boy brought with him. A silent, invisible thread had been spun between the 2 solitary souls in that house, a thread woven from grief and desperation, stretched taut with the tension of all that remained unsaid. The days at Broken Hill bled one into the next, measured not by a calendar but by the movement of the sun and the demands of the land. Abigail rose before dawn, the air in her small room cold and thin. In the beginning, she moved like a ghost through the house, terrified of disturbing the silent man who was her benefactor. She would fetch water from the well, its handle a shock of cold iron in her hands, and set a pot to boil over the hearth while Samuel slept in a drawer she had padded with her spare shawl. Her first act of defiance was to clean. The main room, while not dirty, was layered in the dust of a life lived without attention to domestic comforts. She swept the floors, scrubbed the long table until the grain of the wood showed through, and washed the few dishes with a fierce, concentrated energy. It was work she understood, a way to impose order on the chaos of her new life. She was staking a claim, not on his house, but on her own dignity. She would not be idle. She would earn her keep. Luke never commented on her efforts. He would enter the cabin after his morning chores, his face etched with the weariness of a man who worked from can see to can not see, and simply take the plate of fried bacon and corn cakes she placed before him. He ate in silence, his eyes down, and would leave again without a word. But she noticed that he began to scrape the mud from his boots more carefully before entering. And once, he left a small pail of wild raspberries on the table, a splash of vibrant color in the otherwise drab room. It was a silent acknowledgement, a language she was beginning to learn. Her world expanded from the cabin to the barn. The milk cow, a placid animal with soulful brown eyes, became her responsibility. The first time she tried to milk her, she was clumsy, her hands cramping, the pail receiving only a few pathetic squirts. Luke appeared at the barn door, a shadow against the bright morning light. She expected a gruff dismissal, to be told she was useless. Instead, he walked over, took a low stool, and placed it beside her. "Easy hands," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You are not pulling a rope. You are coaxing." He guided her hands, his touch rough but surprisingly gentle, showing her the rhythmic squeeze and pull. The warmth of his calloused fingers over hers sent a strange jolt through her, a feeling so unexpected it made her breath catch. Under his tutelage, a steady stream of warm, white milk soon drummed against the bottom of the pail. He said nothing more, simply nodded once and walked away, leaving her with the scent of hay, the warmth of the cow, and the lingering impression of his touch. The ranch demanded more. It demanded strength she did not know she possessed. She learned to mend the coarse denim of his work clothes, her stitches small and neat. She planted a small garden near the house, turning over the hard, dry soil with a spade until her back screamed in protest. She hoed rows for corn and beans, her hands blistering and then hardening into calluses. Each small sprout that pushed its way through the earth was a victory, a testament to her will to survive, to create life in this unforgiving place. One afternoon, as she was hanging laundry on a line stretched between two posts, he rode into the yard leading a second horse, a calm-looking mare with a gentle disposition. "You need to learn," he stated, not asked. "It is not safe to be stranded out here." Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. She had only ever ridden in a wagon. A horse was a massive, unpredictable creature. "I cannot," she said, her voice small. "Samuel—" "The boy will be fine on the porch," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "He is safer if his mother knows how to save herself." His logic was as sharp and unpitying as a shard of rock. He was right. Her helplessness was a danger to them both, so she learned. He taught her to saddle the mare, to check the cinch, to mount without fear. Her first rides were a series of jarring bounces around the corral, her body stiff with terror. Luke rode beside her, patient and observant, offering quiet corrections. "Loosen the reins. Let her feel your hands, not fight them. Sit deep in the saddle. Become part of the horse." Slowly, the fear gave way to a thrilling sense of freedom. To be able to move across the vast landscape under her own control was intoxicating. They would ride out in the long, dusty afternoons, checking fences or moving small groups of cattle from one pasture to another. They rarely spoke, but in the shared silence, a new kind of communication was forged. She learned to read the set of his shoulders, the way he scanned the horizon, the subtle signals he gave his horse. They worked together, a team born of necessity, bathed in the sweat and dust of the prairie under the fiery gaze of the setting sun. The lessons did not end with the horse. One evening, he laid a heavy Colt revolver on the table. The dark metal seemed to absorb all the light in the room. "You need to know how to use this, too," he said. This was a different kind of fear. A gun was a tool for ending life. She looked at her hands that were meant to soothe her child, to knead dough, to nurture seeds in the earth. "I do not think I can," she whispered. "You will," he said, his face grim. "There are wolves and coyotes, and there are men worse than either. You will learn to protect what is yours." He took her to a shallow canyon a mile from the house. He set up empty tins on a rock ledge and showed her how to stand, how to aim, how to control her breathing. The first time she pulled the trigger, the noise was a physical blow, a deafening explosion that made her flinch, her ears ringing. The recoil slammed her shoulder, and the bullet went wide, kicking up dust far from its target. But she did not drop the gun. She set her jaw, listened to his instruction to brace herself, and tried again, and again. She practiced until her arm ached and the smell of gunpowder clung to her hair and clothes. She never became a great shot, but she learned to hit the tins more often than she missed. He was giving her a weapon, but more than that, he was giving her a measure of power in a world that had tried to render her powerless. The weeks turned into months. A quiet rhythm settled over Broken Hill. Abigail found her place in it, her life measured by the needs of her son, the demands of the ranch, and the quiet, watchful presence of the man who had saved her. She began to see past his silence, to the deep well of sadness he carried. She saw it in the way his eyes would sometimes linger on Samuel, a look of such profound, unguarded pain that it made her own heart ache in sympathy. She knew of the fire, of the wife and child he had lost. She did not know the details, but she saw the ghosts that walked beside him every day. One late afternoon, the air in the barn was thick and warm, smelling sweetly of hay and livestock. Abigail sat on the low milking stool, her head resting against the cow's warm flank, her hands moving in the familiar, soothing rhythm. Samuel was nearby, lying on a soft blanket in an old wooden crate, gurgling happily at the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light slanting through the barn walls. For the first time in a very long time, she felt a sense of peace, a fragile contentment. This life was hard, but it was real, and it was hers. Suddenly, Samuel's happy noises turned into a fretful cry. It was the familiar, insistent wail of a hungry baby. Abigail murmured to him, trying to soothe him with her voice, her hands still busy. "Just a moment. Little one, Mama is almost done." The crying escalated. She did not hear Luke enter. He moved with a quietness that was part of his nature. She only knew he was there when a shadow fell over her. She looked up, startled. He was standing a few feet away, just watching, his face in shadow. He said nothing, his stillness a heavy presence in the barn. He looked at the crying baby, then back at her. Her first instinct was a flare of defensiveness, a feeling that she was being judged for not immediately tending to her son. But there was no judgment in his expression. There was only a deep, hollow emptiness. As Samuel's cries grew more frantic, Luke moved. He walked over to the crate, his heavy boots making no sound on the straw-covered floor. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then bent down. He scooped Samuel up into his arms. He was clumsy, his large, rough hands looking alien against the baby's soft skin. He held the child stiffly, away from his body, as if he were holding a piece of delicate glass he was afraid of breaking. Samuel continued to wail, his little body squirming. Luke began to rock him, a jerky, awkward motion. He started to hum, a low, tuneless sound deep in his chest. It was not a lullaby. It was just a noise, a vibration. Slowly, miraculously, the baby's cries began to subside. He quieted, his sobs turning to hiccups, his wide, tear-filled eyes staring up at the weathered face of the man holding him. Abigail had stopped milking. The pail sat half full at her feet. She watched, her heart lodged in her throat. She saw not just a reclusive rancher, but a man wrestling with a ghost. She saw the father he had been, the love he had lost. In that moment, the wall between them, the wall of his grief and her gratitude, seemed to dissolve. She was not just a burden he had taken on. She was a witness to his hidden pain. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of sorrow for him, tears of a gratitude so profound it felt like an ache in her chest. He seemed to come back to himself then, his attention shifting from the now quiet baby to her. He saw her tear-streaked face, her wide, compassionate eyes. A look of confusion, of raw vulnerability, crossed his features. He looked down at the child in his arms, as if seeing him for the first time, and then back at her. He spoke, his voice a rough whisper, the words emerging not from his mind, but from some deeper, forgotten place in his soul. It was an echo of the courthouse, but the meaning was entirely new. "He is ours now." The words hung in the warm, dusty air of the barn, a confession and a declaration. He had not said mine. He had said ours. He had, in that unguarded moment, bound her to him and him to her, through the child they both protected. He seemed to realize what he had said as soon as the words were spoken. The vulnerable look vanished, replaced by his usual stoic mask. He carefully placed the now sleeping Samuel back in his crate, turned without another word, and strode out of the barn, leaving Abigail alone with the quiet drumming of the milk in the pail and the thunderous beating of her own heart. He was more than a protector. He was more than a landowner. She was beginning to see him as a man worthy of trust, a place of shelter in the storm. She was beginning to see him as a home. The fragile peace at Broken Hill was as beautiful and as fleeting as the desert wildflowers that bloomed after a rare rain. The unspoken words between Abigail and Luke had become a language of their own, a comfortable silence built from shared labor and mutual respect. She learned the cadence of his footsteps, the subtle shift in his mood that was signaled by the set of his jaw. He, in turn, had grown accustomed to the scent of baking bread in the cabin, the sound of her soft humming as she worked, and the startling, joyous laughter of the baby who was becoming the center of their small universe. The word he had spoken in the barn, ours, echoed in the space between them, a promise and a fact that had redefined their world. But the world was larger than Broken Hill, a fact they could not ignore forever. Supplies ran low, flour, salt, coffee. The necessities that tethered them to civilization needed replenishing. One morning, Luke announced he was riding into Redemption Gulch. A knot of anxiety tightened in Abigail's stomach. "Let me come with you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I am not afraid." "I know you are not," he answered, his eyes on the rifle he was checking. "That is why you will stay here, with Samuel. There is no reason for all of us to face them." She did not argue. She knew he was right. His concern was practical, not a judgment on her courage. She watched him ride out, a solitary figure shrinking against the vastness of the prairie, and a cold dread settled over her, a premonition that the sanctuary they had built was about to be breached. Luke felt the change the moment he rode onto the main street of Redemption Gulch. It was not a thing he could see, but a thing he could feel. The usual hum of activity seemed to hush as he passed. Men who would normally have given him a curt nod now found something fascinating to study in the dirt at their feet. The women, gathered outside the general store, fell silent, their conversations ceasing as their eyes followed him, their gazes as sharp and pointed as sewing needles. The air was thick with whispers, with the poison of righteous gossip. He tied his horse and went inside the store. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, who was usually full of talk about the weather and cattle prices, became intensely focused on counting a stack of tins, his face a mask of strained neutrality. Luke gave his list. The items were gathered in a silence that was more damning than any accusation. As he paid, the storekeeper finally met his eyes, a flicker of something like pity in them. "You ought to be careful, Brennan," the man mumbled, his voice low. "The judge is on the warpath. He feels you made a fool of him." "The judge made a fool of himself," Luke said, his voice flat. He shouldered the sack of supplies and walked out. He did not get far. Judge Amos Trigg was waiting for him, flanked by two rough-looking men Luke did not recognize. The judge's face was puffed with indignation, his small eyes gleaming with malice. "Brennan," Trigg said, his voice carrying for all the street to hear, "I had hoped you would come to your senses, but it seems you persist in this charade." "There is no charade." "Judge," Luke said, his body tense, his hand resting near the pistol at his hip, "I gave my word. The boy is under my protection." "Protection," the judge scoffed, a sound of pure derision. "Is that what you call it, harboring that woman, living with her under your roof? Outside the bonds of matrimony? It is a disgrace, a violation of all moral and social decency." The accusation hung in the air, aimed not just at him but at the unseen Abigail. Luke felt a surge of cold fury, a protective instinct so fierce it took all his will to control it. "What happens on my land is my business." "Not when it offends public morality," Trigg shot back, his confidence growing as more townsfolk stopped to watch the confrontation. "And not when it involves a child this court has an interest in. I am warning you. Renounce this absurdity. Turn the woman and the child over to the proper authorities. If you do not, I will see to it that you are ruined. I will petition the territorial government. We will find a reason, any reason, to declare your homestead forfeit. We will see you driven from this valley for your defiance and your sin." The threat was real. A man's claim to his land was only as strong as the government that backed it, and men like Trigg knew how to manipulate that system. He was threatening to take everything, not just Abigail and Samuel, but the ranch itself, the legacy of his parents, the only home he had ever known. Luke said nothing. He simply stared at the judge, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. After a long moment, he turned, untied his horse, and mounted. He rode out of town without a backward glance, the weight of the judge's threat a heavy stone in his gut. When he returned to Broken Hill, Abigail knew at once that something was wrong. The lines around his eyes were deeper, his silence heavier than she had ever felt it. She took the sack of supplies from him, her fingers brushing his, and she felt the tension thrumming through him like a plucked wire. That evening, after Samuel was asleep, he told her he did not soften the words. He laid out the judge's threat in stark, simple terms, the town's gossip, the accusation of immorality, the danger to the ranch. She listened, her hands clenched in her lap, her heart growing colder with every word. She had thought, foolishly, that their isolation was a shield, but the world had reached them. Her past, her sin, was now a weapon being aimed at the heart of the man who had saved her. "I will leave," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I will take Samuel and I will go. I will not let you lose your home because of me." "No," he said, his voice so forceful it made her jump. He was standing by the fireplace, one hand braced against the stone mantel. "You will not. This is your home now. His home." He turned to face her, his eyes blazing in the firelight. "We do not run. We fight." In the days that followed, a new tension settled over the ranch. It was the watchfulness of a homestead under siege. Luke spent his nights cleaning his rifle and his revolver, his movements economical and deadly serious. By day, he worked with a feverish intensity, as if he could build a fortress of sweat and labor to protect them. Abigail felt the change in herself. Too, the fear was there, a cold companion, but beneath it was a bedrock of resolve. She had found something worth fighting for, and she would not surrender it easily. The attack came on a moonless night, when the wind was just beginning to stir, a low moan that promised a storm. Abigail was jolted from a light sleep by a sound she could not at first identify, a frantic, panicked bellowing from the cattle. And then she saw it. A hellish orange light was flickering against her window pane. She threw on a dress and ran into the main room. Luke was already at the door, pulling on his boots, his rifle in his hand. "The barn," he said, his voice a low growl. "Stay in the house. Lock the door. Do not come out." He was gone before she could answer. She ran to the window and her heart stopped. The barn, their barn, the place of quiet moments and shared labor, was engulfed in flames. The fire leaped toward the black sky, a monstrous, hungry thing, consuming years of his life's work in a furious roar. She did as he said, barring the door, her hands trembling. She scooped up Samuel, who was now awake and crying, and held him tight, murmuring words of comfort she did not feel. She could hear shouting from outside, the terrified shrieks of the horses, the crackle and crash of burning timber. Then the wind hit. It came not as a moan, but as a physical blow against the cabin walls, driving with it a blinding, scouring curtain of sand and dust. A sandstorm. It would whip the fire into an uncontrollable frenzy. Through the howling wind and the roaring flames, she heard a new sound, the desperate, thirsty cries of the cattle trapped in the main corral. Their only escape route blocked by a wall of fire. The well. The well was in the middle of the yard, away from the worst of the flames. If she could get the gate open, they might have a chance. They were his livelihood. They were their future. She looked at the crying baby in her arms. Luke had told her to stay inside, but she was not the same woman who had knelt on the courthouse floor. She was a woman of Broken Hill now. Clutching Samuel to her chest, pulling her shawl over his head to shield him from the smoke and sand, she unbarred the door and plunged into the maelstrom. The heat from the fire was a physical blast, and the wind tore at her, trying to rip the child from her arms. Sand scoured her face, blinding her. She lowered her head and ran, guided by instinct, toward the corral. She fumbled with the heavy wooden latch on the gate, her fingers raw and clumsy. The panicked animals surged past her, a river of terrified flesh, finding their way toward the relative safety of the well. She stumbled after them, her lungs burning, her eyes streaming. She reached the low stone wall of the well and collapsed against it, shielding Samuel with her body, a lone figure in a world of fire and wind and chaos. Luke, having managed to free the horses and drive them into a far pasture, saw the open corral gate and the cattle huddled near the well, a primal fear, colder and more terrible than the heat of the fire, seized him. She was not in the house. He roared her name, but his voice was swallowed by the storm. He ran, his heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm against his ribs. He searched the swirling chaos, his eyes burning from the smoke, his mind screaming a silent prayer. And then he saw her, a small, huddled shape against the well, the precious bundle of her son held tight against her. He reached her in 3 long strides and fell to his knees, his hands grabbing her, touching her face, her shoulders, as if to reassure himself that she was real, that she was unharmed. He pulled her and the baby into his arms, crushing them against him in an embrace that was both fierce and desperate. His whole body was trembling. "I thought I had lost you," he choked out, his voice raw with a terror that stripped away every last one of his defenses. "I thought I had lost you. Again." Abigail looked up at him, her hair wild, her face smudged with soot and tears. The world was burning around them, but in that moment, all she could see was the raw, unguarded fear in his eyes, a fear that was all for her. "You said, again," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. He tightened his grip, burying his face in her hair, his words a broken confession against her skin. "Because I lost my family once," he said, the pain of years pouring out of him. "I will not let that happen again." The morning after the fire was unnaturally quiet. The wind had died, leaving behind a sky the color of ash and the pervasive, acrid smell of burned wood and shattered dreams. The barn was a blackened skeleton, its proud timbers reduced to charcoal spars reaching like pleading fingers toward the gray heavens. Luke and Abigail stood before the ruins, the devastation of physical presence between them. His confession, spoken in the heart of the storm, had changed everything. The walls of his solitude and her gratitude had crumbled, and in their place was the fragile, terrifying foundation of something new. "I will need to ride to the Miller place," he said, his voice rough from the smoke he had inhaled. "See if I can buy some of their seasoned lumber. And I will need nails, a lot of them. I will have to go to Flat Creek. I will not give Redemption Gulch my coin." Flat Creek was a 2-day ride. The thought of him being gone that long sent a chill of fear through her that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Be careful," she whispered, the words inadequate. He turned to her, and for the first time, he let her see past the stoic mask to the man beneath. His eyes, usually so stormy and distant, were clear and filled with a deep, aching concern. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently brushed a soot smudge from her cheek. The touch was light, but it sent a current of warmth through her entire body. "Bar the door behind me," he said. "Keep the rifle close. Do not open it for anyone but me." He looked toward the cabin where Samuel was sleeping. "I will be back before you know it." She watched him ride away, his back straight, a man carrying the weight of 2 worlds, the one he had lost and the one he was now desperate to protect. She did as he commanded, sliding the heavy wooden bar across the door, the sound echoing in the silent cabin. The rifle felt heavy and cold in her hands. The house, which had become a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Its safety depended on one lock and her own unsteady courage. 2 days passed in a blur of anxious activity. She cared for Samuel, tended her small garden, and tried not to let her eyes stray to the empty horizon. On the 3rd morning, she was kneading dough on the table when she heard the sound of approaching horses. It was too soon for Luke's return. A cold dread snaked around her heart. She grabbed the rifle, her hands slick with a nervous sweat, and peered through a small crack in the window shutter. Her blood ran cold. It was Judge Trigg, and with him were Sheriff Dugan and the 2 hard-faced men from town. They rode into the yard as if they owned it, their horses trampling the very ground she and Luke had fought to defend. "Abigail Harlow," the judge's voice boomed, a sound she had hoped never to hear again. "By the authority of the Montana Territory, I have a warrant for your arrest." She held the rifle tighter, her knuckles white. On what charge she called out, her voice trembling but defiant. "Deceiving the court," the judge announced, a triumphant smirk on his face as he waved a piece of paper. "Luke Brennan is not the father of your child. He laid a false claim, an act of perjury, and you, madam, are his accomplice. You will be returned to Redemption Gulch, and the child will be placed in the care of the territory, as was originally ordered." It was a lie, a legal trap twisted from the truth. They had found their excuse. Sheriff Dugan had the decency to look ashamed, his gaze fixed on his saddle horn. The other 2 men dismounted, their expressions eager. "You have no right," she yelled, her voice cracking. "This is our home." "This is a den of inequity," the judge spat. "Sheriff, do your duty." The 2 men moved toward the door. "This is your last chance, ma'am," the sheriff called out, his voice heavy with regret. "Do not make us force our way in." She knew it was hopeless. She could not fight 4 men, but she would not cower. She unbarred the door and stood on the threshold. Samuel held tight in one arm, the rifle in the other. "You will not take my son," she said, her voice low and fierce. One of the hired men laughed. "Look at the little prairie hen, all ruffled up." He took a step forward, and she raised the rifle. The man froze, his smirk vanishing. "I would not," she said, the cold resolve in her voice surprising even herself. For a moment, no one moved. Then, with a roar of fury, Judge Trigg gave the order. "Take her," Now. The men lunged. She tried to bring the rifle to bear, but one of them grabbed the barrel, wrenching it from her grasp. The other seized her arm. She fought, kicking and struggling, her entire being focused on holding onto Samuel, but they were too strong. They tore the crying baby from her arms and handed him to the sheriff. They bound her hands in front of her with a rough piece of rope and dragged her toward a waiting horse. The ride back to Redemption Gulch was a nightmare. She was forced to ride ahead of one of the thugs, her hands tied, her heart breaking with every sob that came from Samuel, who was held awkwardly in the sheriff's arms. When they arrived, the town square was already filling with people, drawn by the news of her capture. It was a spectacle, and they were hungry for it. They pulled her from the horse and shoved her into the center of the square. The whispers and jeers started immediately. Sinner, harlot, look at her, brazen as you please. The faces in the crowd were a blur of scorn and self-satisfaction. They were seeing their judgment confirmed, their harsh morality vindicated. Judge Trigg stood on the steps of the courthouse like a Roman emperor, soaking in his victory. Abigail ignored them all. She stood as tall as she could, her chin up, her eyes locked on her son. He was her only reality in this circus of hate. Sheriff Dugan held the crying baby, his face a mask of misery. He was a man trapped, his duty at war with his conscience. Then, from the far end of the street, came a sound, the frantic, desperate drumming of a horse ridden at a full, reckless gallop. A wave of hope, so fierce it was painful, surged through Abigail. He burst into the square like a force of nature, his horse lathered in sweat, its eyes wild. Luke pulled the animal to a skidding halt, the crowd scrambling to get out of his way. He was covered in the dust of the trail, his face a mask of cold, deadly rage. He swung down from the saddle before the horse had even come to a complete stop, his rifle in one hand, his revolver strapped to his hip, his eyes burning with a fire that seemed to scorch the very air, found hers, then moved to the baby in the sheriff's arms. He took a step forward, his movements fluid and predatory. The crowd fell silent, their jeers forgotten, their bloodlust replaced by a primal fear. "Let them go, Dugan," Luke said, his voice dangerously quiet. Judge Trigg bristled, his authority challenged. "This man is an outlaw. He has defied the court. Arrest him." The two hired thugs, emboldened by the judge, drew their pistols. Luke ignored them. His entire focus was on the sheriff. "Give me the boy. Sheriff," Luke said, his voice a low command. The judge screeched, "Do not listen to him. I am the law here." He gestured to his men. "Take him." Luke finally turned his gaze to the two men, and the sheer, undiluted fury in his eyes made them hesitate. He took another step toward the sheriff, his hand moving to the butt of his revolver. "If you want to take her child," he said, his voice ringing out across the silent square for every man, woman, and child to hear, "you will go through me first." It was the final line drawn, the declaration of a father, a husband in all but name. One of the thugs, perhaps trying to prove his courage, made his move. He raised his pistol. The world exploded in a cacophony of sound. Luke drew his revolver with a speed that was a blur, his own shot a split second after the thug's. The man cried out and staggered back, clutching a hand that was suddenly slick with blood. The second man fired, his shot wild. Chaos erupted. People screamed and ran for cover. Luke did not flinch. He fired again, his bullet kicking up dust at the second man's feet, forcing him to dive behind a water trough. In that moment of distraction, Luke lunged forward. He was not aiming for the thugs. He was aiming for his son. He reached the sheriff just as another shot rang out. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in his left shoulder. He grunted, stumbling, but his arms did not fail. He grabbed Samuel from the sheriff's unresisting grasp, pulling the boy tight against his chest. He turned, instinctively shielding the baby with his own body, his back to the remaining gunmen. He saw Abigail, her eyes wide with terror, her face pale. Another bullet whizzed past his head, splintering the wood of the courthouse steps behind him. The townspeople, who had scattered, were now frozen in place, watching the terrible drama unfold. They saw the blood spreading across the back of Luke Brennan's shirt. They saw him ignore his own wound, his every instinct focused on protecting the small child in his arms. They saw a man who had lost everything once, now willing to bleed, to die, to prevent it from happening again. The scorn on their faces began to melt away, replaced by a dawning, horrified awe. This was not a sordid affair between two sinners. This was something fierce and pure and undeniable. It was a love that was willing to face down guns and judgment. It was a man shielding his family. Sheriff Dugan, his face like thunder, finally made his choice. He drew his own pistol, but he did not aim it at Luke. He aimed it at the hired man peeking out from behind the water trough. "Drop it," Dugan roared, his voice the true sound of the law at last. "Drop it now, or so help me God. I will put you in the ground myself." The gunman, seeing the sheriff's resolve and the mood of the crowd turning, let his pistol clatter to the dusty street. The shootout was over. In the ringing silence, there was only the sound of a baby's frightened cries, and the heavy, ragged breathing of the wounded man who held him. The town had seen the truth, written in blood and sacrifice, and their world of simple, cruel certainties had been fractured forever. The world returned to Luke in fragments of pain and sound, a dull, throbbing fire in his shoulder, the distant cry of a baby, a cool hand on his forehead. He was floating in a gray, feverish fog, haunted by the ghosts of smoke and gunfire. He saw his wife Sarah's face, her smile dissolving into flames. He heard his daughter Lily's laughter, then her screams. He felt the terrible heat, the suffocating helplessness. Then another face would appear in the haze, a woman with determined, compassionate eyes and soot on her cheek, her voice a low murmur that seemed to pull him back from the edge of the inferno. He fought toward that voice, that steady presence, as a drowning man fights toward the surface. In the town square, the aftermath of the shootout was a scene of stunned silence and dawning shame as Luke sagged, his lifeblood staining the dust. It was Mrs. Ruth who broke the spell. She pushed through the gawking crowd, her face a mask of fury and resolve, and went straight to Abigail. "Give me the baby," she commanded, her voice sharp. She took Samuel from Abigail's nerveless arms. "You, see to your man." That simple, declarative phrase, "your man," struck the town with the force of a revelation. Abigail, galvanized by the words, flew to Luke's side, her hands going to his wound, trying foolishly to staunch the flow of blood. Sheriff Dugan, his face like carved granite, finally and fully chose his side. "Someone get Dr. Miller, now!" he roared. He turned on the two hired men, who were being surrounded by a now hostile crowd. "You two are under arrest for attempted murder." Then his cold eyes landed on Judge Trigg, who was sputtering, his victory having turned to ash in his mouth. "And you, Judge, are a disgrace. You will consider yourself confined to your quarters until the circuit judge can be summoned." The shift was absolute. The town, which had gathered for a spectacle of judgment, had instead witnessed an act of profound sacrifice. They saw not a sinner, but a woman beloved. They saw not a reclusive eccentric, but a man willing to die for his family. Dr. Miller came running, his black bag in hand. He was a practical man who dealt in flesh and bone, not rumor and piety. One look at Luke's wound and the surrounding scene told him all he needed to know. "We need to get this bullet out," the doctor said, cutting away the bloody shirt. "And we need to get him home. He will not survive in the town jail." And so, a strange procession left Redemption Gulch that afternoon. Luke, barely conscious, lay in the bed of his own buckboard wagon, which was driven by a grim-faced Sheriff Dugan. Abigail sat beside him, bathing his face with a damp cloth, her eyes never leaving him. Mrs. Ruth followed in her own buggy, holding a now sleeping Samuel. having packed a crate with food, clean linens, and medical supplies from her own stores. The town watched them go, their silence no longer one of scorn, but of a deep and unsettling respect. The days that followed were a waking dream for Abigail. Luke's fever raged. The bullet had been deep, and the doctor had warned that the real fight would be against the infection. Her world shrank to the small space of Luke's room, a space that had once been his sanctuary of grief and was now the battlefield for his life. She was his constant shadow. She spooned broth and water between his cracked lips, though he swallowed little. She bathed his hot skin with cool water, her hands moving with a tenderness that was a prayer. She changed the dressing on his shoulder, her stomach turning at the angry, inflamed look of the wound, but her hands remaining steady. She sat by his bed through the long nights, listening to his ragged breathing, her heart seizing every time it faltered. Samuel, as if sensing the gravity of the situation, was a quiet, watchful baby, his presence a small, warm anchor in the storm of their uncertainty. In his delirium, Luke spoke. He mumbled names she did not know, Sarah and Lily, his words tangled with memories of the fire. The smoke, so thick, I could not reach them. I am sorry, so sorry. Abigail would take his hand, a hand that felt frighteningly limp, and she would speak to him in a low, soothing voice. It is all right, Luke. You are safe. I am here. Samuel is here. We are safe. She did not know if he could hear her, but she spoke the words anyway, for him and for herself, listening to his broken confessions. She finally understood the true depth of his solitude. He had not just lost his family, he had been crucified by his failure to save them. His rescue of her and Samuel was not an act of charity, it was an act of redemption, a desperate attempt to rewrite the most tragic chapter of his life. And she, in turn, realized her feelings for him had moved far beyond gratitude. The thought of losing him was a physical agony, a tearing at the fabric of her own soul. He had become her home, and the thought of that home being extinguished was more terrifying than any town's judgment. On the morning of the fourth day, the fever broke, his breathing evened out, and for the first time he slept a deep, peaceful sleep. Abigail, exhausted to her bones, allowed herself to doze in the chair beside his bed, her hand resting on the edge of his mattress. She awoke to the feeling of being watched. She opened her eyes, and he was looking at her. His own eyes, which had been clouded with fever, were clear, the color of a dawn sky after a storm. They were filled with a profound exhaustion, but they were lucid. He was back. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief caught in her throat. She could not speak. He tried to move his good arm, and a grimace of pain crossed his face. Easy, she whispered, her voice husky with sleep and emotion. Do not try to move. He relaxed back into the pillows, his gaze never leaving her face. He looked around the room, taking in the details. Then his eyes settled back on her. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the weariness in the slump of her shoulders. He saw the fierce, unwavering devotion. You stayed, he said, his voice a dry rasp. Of course I stayed, she answered, tears welling in her eyes. Where else would I go? He was silent for a long moment, simply looking at her. The air in the room was thick with all the things they had never said, all the emotions they had held at bay. The fire, the storm, the shootout, it had all been a crucible, burning away everything but the essential truth between them. Slowly, her hand trembling, she reached out. She did not touch his face or his good hand. Her fingers went to his wounded shoulder, hovering for a moment before gently, tentatively, touching the clean linen of the bandage. It was a gesture of profound intimacy, a communion with his pain, an acknowledgement of the sacrifice he had made for her. For them. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. I used to think I was unfit to be a mother, she whispered, the confession she had held in her heart since the day she first felt the scorn of the town. It was a statement of her deepest fear, the brand that had been seared onto her soul. Luke's expression softened, the hard lines of his face easing into something she had never seen before, a look of incredible tenderness. He managed to lift his good hand, his fingers closing weakly but surely around her wrist, stopping its trembling. "You are more than a mother, Abigail," he said, his voice gaining a little strength, a little of its old resonance. He held her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw her own worth reflected back at her, clear and undeniable. "You are the heart of this place." The words were a balm on her deepest wound. He was not just absolving her of the town's judgment, he was anointing her. She was not just a resident, a charity case, a mother under his protection. She was the center, the heart. He tugged gently on her wrist, drawing her closer. Her breath hitched. The small space between them crackled with a new and powerful energy. He was weak, wounded, but his intent was unmistakable. She leaned in, her other hand coming to rest on the mattress beside his head to steady herself. Their first kiss was not one of passion, but of homecoming. It was as slow and quiet as the dawn breaking over the prairie. It was tentative, a trembling exploration. The soft touch of his lips on hers, a question and an answer all in one. It was a kiss born of shared trauma and silent understanding, of a lonely man finding a reason to live and a lost woman finding a place to belong. It was deep and profound, a sealing of a bond that had been forged in fire and defended with blood. It was the taste of salt from her tears and the promise of a future she had never dared to imagine. When they finally broke apart, they simply looked at each other, their breathing unsteady. The morning sun streamed through the window, filling the room with a warm, golden light. Samuel made a soft cooing sound from his cradle in the corner, a gentle reminder of the life they had fought for. The immediate battle was won. They were together, and they were, for the first time, a family. But as Abigail looked out the window at the smoke-stained sky and the skeletal remains of the barn, she knew their peace was a fragile one. The legal papers still existed. Judge Trigg, though humbled, was not defeated. The world of Redemption Gulch and its laws was still out there, just beyond the horizon, a storm that had receded but had not yet passed. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet healing. Luke's body mended with the stubborn slowness of a deep wound, but it was his spirit that seemed to undergo the more profound transformation. The haunted, distant look in his eyes was replaced by a watchful tenderness, a focus that was always directed toward Abigail and Samuel. He was still a man of few words, but his silences were different now. They were not walls of grief, but spaces of comfortable companionship. Abigail, in turn, found a strength she never knew she possessed. She ran the ranch with a quiet efficiency, her days a blur of chores and caregiving. She milked the cow, tended her garden, and looked after the cattle that had survived the fire, all while keeping a constant vigil by Luke's side. She learned the landscape of his pain, the lines of exhaustion around his mouth, the way he would clench his jaw when he moved his shoulder too quickly. And she learned to soothe it with a cool cloth, a warm broth, or simply the steady presence of her hand on his. They began to rebuild the barn together. At first, he could only direct her, his arm still in a sling, his voice guiding her as she sorted the salvaged timber from the wreckage. Later, as his strength returned, they worked side by side, measuring, sawing, and lifting beams into place. The rhythmic sound of their hammer blows became the new heartbeat of the ranch, a testament to their shared resilience. They were not just rebuilding a structure, they were building a life, nail by nail, board by board. One bright, clear morning, a lone rider appeared on the horizon. It was Sheriff Dugan. Luke and Abigail exchanged a look, a flicker of the old fear returning. Before the Luke gave a slight nod, he met the sheriff in the yard, his stance relaxed but wary. "Brennan, ma'am," Dugan said, tipping his hat. He looked different than he had in town. The hard edge of his authority had been replaced by a weary sort of decency. "I came to tell you that the circuit judge, Judge Harding, will be arriving in Redemption Gulch in 2 weeks. He has agreed to hear your case. We already had a hearing, Luke said, his voice flat. That was not a hearing. That was a witch trial. The sheriff corrected him, a hint of shame in his voice. This will be different. Judge Harding is a fair man. He follows the letter of the law, not the whispers of a mob. He looked directly at Abigail. But you will both have to be there. You will have to speak for yourselves. He paused, then added, There are people in town who wish to speak for you, too. The news settled over them, a heavy blanket of uncertainty. To return to that town, to that courthouse, felt like reopening a wound that was just beginning to scar over, but they both knew it was necessary. Their peace was borrowed. Their family's legitimacy a thing of shadow and assumption. They needed the sanction of the law, the clear light of day, to truly be free. The day they rode back into Redemption Gulch, the town felt like a different place. They rode together on the buckboard, Luke handling the reins, Abigail beside him with Samuel in her lap. They were not a reclusive rancher and a shamed woman. They were a family. As they passed down the main street, a hush fell over the town, but it was not the hostile silence of before. It was a silence of respect, of contemplation. A few men, grizzled ranchers and storekeepers, gave Luke a slow, deliberate nod. A few women, who had once looked at Abigail with scorn, now met her gaze with a new and startling curiosity. Some even with a flicker of admiration. Luke's sacrifice had not just saved her, it had forced the entire town to look into the mirror and question the reflection they saw. The courthouse was packed, but the atmosphere was sober and tense, not the feverish, gossipy mood of the first hearing. Judge Harding was a tall, lean man with intelligent gray eyes and a face that seemed incapable of anything but solemn consideration. Judge Trigg was also present, but he was not on the bench. He sat at a small table to the side, his face a blotchy mask of resentment, a spectator at the dismantling of his own petty kingdom. The hearing began. Judge Harding reviewed the initial order, his brow furrowed. Then he called the first witness. The court calls Mrs. Ruth Gable. Mrs. Ruth walked to the front, her back straight, her bonnet perfectly tied. She spoke in a clear, steady voice, her words simple and devastatingly effective. She told of how Abigail had come to her, a frightened girl with nothing but the clothes on her back and a fierce love for her unborn child. She told of how Abigail had worked tirelessly, scrubbing floors and mending clothes, never asking for a handout, only for a chance. She was a better mother before that baby was even born than some women are in a lifetime. Mrs., Ruth concluded, her sharp gaze sweeping over the faces in the crowd. Next, the sheriff called one of the ranch hands Luke had hired to help with the rebuilding, a young, sunburned cowboy who twisted his hat in his hands but spoke with an unwavering loyalty. He told of the fire, of how he had seen Abigail run into the smoke and the storm to save the cattle, her own child clutched in her arms. I have seen men with twice her size and half her grit, he said, looking directly at the judge. That ranch is still standing because of her, and because of him, he added, nodding toward Luke. He is a hard man, but a fair one. They belong together. Finally, Judge Harding looked at Abigail. Mrs. Harlow, he said, his voice unexpectedly gentle. Do you have anything you wish to say? Abigail stood, her legs trembling slightly. She held Samuel in her arms, a living, breathing testament to everything she had fought for. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at the judge, and then she looked at Luke. I love my son. Your Honor, she said, her voice clear and strong. He is my whole world. I did not have much to give him, but I gave him all the love I had. And then this man. She turned her gaze fully on Luke, and the entire room could feel the profound depth of her emotion. This good and honorable man gave us both a home. He saved us. All I want is to stay in that home, with my son, and with him. She sat down. There was nothing more to say. Her life was her testimony. The final piece came from Sheriff Dugan. He presented evidence, meticulously gathered, of Judge Trigg's malfeasance. He had spoken to the hired gunman, who, facing prison, had confessed that Trigg had not only hired them to intimidate Luke, but had promised them a share of the Broken Hill land once he had successfully used the law to seize it. It was a clear and ugly case of corruption, of using his office for personal gain. Judge Harding listened to it all without expression. When the testimony was finished, he sat in silence for a long time, his fingers steepled before him. The entire room held its breath. Then he spoke, his voice filling the quiet hall with the clear, cold weight of law. The original ruling of this court was a perversion of justice, based on prejudice rather than fact. He declared, "All charges against Abigail Harlow are hereby dismissed. The warrant for her arrest is vacated." He then turned his steely gaze upon Judge Trigg. "Amos Trigg, you are removed from this bench, effective immediately. You will be held for a full investigation by the Territorial Marshal on charges of conspiracy and abuse of power." A collective sigh of relief went through the room. It was over. Judge Harding was not finished. He looked at Luke. "Mr. Brennan, your actions in this matter, while unorthodox, were clearly motivated by a desire to protect the innocent. This court sees no reason to deny your petition. You are hereby granted full legal and paternal rights to the child. Samuel," he picked up his gavel, "and this court wishes your family nothing but the best." He brought the gavel down, the sound not a crack of doom, but a clean, definitive note of resolution. As they walked out of the courthouse, the townspeople parted to let them pass. The whispers that followed them now were not of scorn, but of awe. A young boy pointed and said to his mother, "Look, it is the Brennan boy." The name stuck. Samuel was no longer the Harlow bastard. He was the Brennan boy. They did not stay in town. Their life was at the ranch that evening, as the sun began to set, casting long golden fingers of light across the valley. Luke led Abigail and Samuel down to the small, cottonwood-lined creek that ran through his property. The water chuckled over the smooth stones, and the wind whispered through the leaves. There was no music. There was no preacher. There were only the three of them and the vast, silent witness of the Montana sky. Luke turned to her, taking both her hands in his. His were calloused and strong, hers smaller but no less capable. He looked into her eyes, and in their depths, she saw a future she had never dreamed possible. "I have not had much use for fancy words or promises. Abigail," he began, his voice a low, steady rumble. "This land is hard, life is hard, but I know this. My life was empty before you came. You and Samuel, you filled a hole in me I did not think could ever be filled." He took a deep breath, his heart in his eyes. "I love you. I want you to be my wife. I want this to be our family. Forever." Tears streamed down her face, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh, yes, Luke." He smiled, a true, brilliant smile that transformed his weathered face, making him look years younger. He gently touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. He leaned in and kissed her, a deep, loving kiss that sealed their vows more surely than any preacher could. He pulled back and looked from her to Samuel, who was gurgling happily in her arms. He wrapped his arms around both of them, pulling them into a tight embrace, a complete and perfect circle. He buried his face in her hair, his voice a low, contented whisper against her ear, repeating the promise that had become their truth. Ours now, always. 7 years passed. The seasons turned over the Montana Territory, each one leaving its mark on the land and the people who called it home. At Broken Hill, the changes were profound. The wind still blew across the high prairie, but it no longer carried a sound of loneliness. Now, it carried the chime of a bell, the distant laughter of children, and the low, contented sounds of a ranch that was not just surviving, but thriving. The grass in the valley grew thick and green, a testament to years of careful management and hard work. The new barn, larger and sturdier than the one it replaced, stood as a proud monument to their resilience. The corrals were full, and the herd of cattle that grazed in the pastures was strong and healthy. The small log cabin that had once been a fortress of solitude had grown. A new wing, built from the same sturdy timber as the barn, extended from one side, its windows bright and welcoming. The ranch was no longer a place of ghosts. It was a place of vibrant, undeniable life. From the window of that new wing, Abigail Brennan watched her world. She was 30 years old now, the last traces of the frightened girl who had knelt in the courthouse having been weathered away by sun, wind, and a deep, abiding happiness. The lines around her eyes were from smiling, not from fear. Every morning, she would stand at this window with a cup of coffee and watch the sun rise, the light spilling over the distant mountains and washing the valley in gold. That light, for her, would always be a symbol of justice, a daily reminder that even the deepest darkness must eventually yield to the dawn. A small hand tugged on her dress. "Mama, is it time yet?" She looked down and smiled at her son. Samuel was 7 years old, a sturdy, bright-eyed boy with his mother's gentle smile and his father's serious, watchful gaze. He was the living, breathing heart of Broken Hill, a child of courage and love, completely unaware of the storm that had surrounded his birth. "Almost time, my love," she said, stroking his dark hair. "Go and make sure the slates are clean." The new wing of the house was a school. It was a simple, single room, filled with a long table, several benches, and a large blackboard Luke had painstakingly constructed. Every morning, after the ranch chores were done, children would arrive. They were a motley collection, the children of hired hands from neighboring ranches, a few orphans that Sheriff Dugan had personally brought to her attention, and even the timid daughter of a woman from Redemption Gulch who had recently lost her husband. On 2 afternoons a week, the children were replaced by the women themselves, widows and young mothers who had never had the chance to learn their letters, who now gathered to trace the alphabet under Abigail's patient guidance. She had not set out to be a teacher. The idea had grown slowly, born from her own past. She knew what it was to be powerless, to have your fate decided by others because you lacked the means or the knowledge to speak for yourself. A person who could read a contract, who could write a letter, who could understand the numbers in a ledger, was a person who could not be so easily cheated or dismissed. She was not just teaching reading and writing. She was teaching self-reliance. She was giving back the gift of dignity that Luke had first given her. Luke never questioned her school. He had built the room for her, had hauled the lumber and hammered the nails himself. He would often stand at the doorway for a moment on his way to the fields, a silent, broad-shouldered observer. He would watch Abigail at the blackboard, her face animated as she explained a sum or guided a small hand in forming a letter, and a look of profound, quiet pride would settle on his features. He had seen her strength in the fire and in the courthouse, but here, in this room, he saw the true breadth of her spirit, a boundless compassion that sought to heal the world's wounds, one person at a time. His own wounds had healed in a way he had never thought possible. The ghosts of Sarah and Lily had not vanished, but they no longer haunted him. They had become gentle memories, sad but sweet, integrated into the man he was now. He had come to understand that the deepest way to honor the family he had lost was to pour all his love and protection into the family he had found. His days were still long and filled with the relentless labor of the ranch, but the purpose of that labor had been transformed. He no longer worked to forget. He worked to build. He was not just raising cattle. He was raising a son. He was not just maintaining a homestead. He was nurturing a home. The true end of his day, the anchor of his existence, came at sunset. Every evening, as the sky bled into hues of orange and purple, Samuel would be the first to spot him, a distant rider cresting the hill. The boy would let out a whoop and run, his small legs pumping, down the path to meet him. Luke would swing down from his horse, his tired face breaking into a rare, true smile, and sweep his son up into a one-armed embrace. He would walk back to the house, the boy perched on his hip, chattering about his day, and his eyes would seek out Abigail. She would be waiting, standing on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. He would hand Samuel off to her, and then he would simply stand before her for a moment, his gaze taking her in as if he were memorizing her face for the first time. He would cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, a silent communion that spoke more than words ever could. Then he would kiss her, a kiss that tasted of dust and sweat and the deep, unwavering certainty of his love. It was a ritual, a daily reaffirmation of the promise he had made by the creek, ours now, always. One cool autumn evening, after the students had gone home and Samuel was asleep in his bed, Luke and Abigail sat together on a bench he had built on the crest of the windy hill, the very spot where the first lonely cabin had stood. From here, they could see the entire valley spread out below them, the lights from their own house a warm, golden beacon in the gathering twilight. The wind whispered around them, the same constant, ageless wind that had once seemed so full of judgment. Now, it sounded like a lullaby. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Abigail asked, her voice soft. She leaned her head against his good shoulder, the one that bore no scar. He was silent for a long time. Looking out at the land, "I think about it every day," he finally answered, his voice a low rumble. "I was in town for a new axe handle. I was not supposed to be there. I almost did not go in, but I heard the baby crying." He paused, the memory still vivid. It was the same sound Lily used to make when she was hungry. "I walked in, and I saw you on the floor, holding him, and it was like the whole world stopped. I was not thinking about the law, or the town, or what was right. All I could think was that I had failed to protect my family once. I was not going to let it happen again." She tightened her arm around his. "You did not fail, Luke. Some things are like a fire. You cannot stop them. You can only save what you can from the flames." He turned to look at her, his eyes dark and serious in the fading light. "You saved me, Abigail. I was just a ghost, walking around in my own memories. You and Samuel, you brought me back to life." "We saved each other," she whispered, and it was the simplest and most profound truth of their lives. They sat in a comfortable silence, watching the first stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the night sky. The story of their love was written in the landscape below them. It was in the sturdy timbers of the new barn, in the bright, welcoming windows of the school, in the green grass that covered the scars of the past. It was a testament to the idea that justice is not something handed down from a bench, but something that grows in the human heart when it is nurtured with courage and compassion. It was proof that love, real and true, could heal the deepest prejudices, and that the title of mother, or father, or family is not defined by law or by blood, but by the unwavering commitment of a loving heart. The light in their window shone out into the vast Montana darkness, a single point of hope and warmth, a promise that even in the wildest of places, a home could be built, a future could be forged, and love could write a new and better law. Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.